Mine would be the horrendous nightmares. But I think that's down to the medication rather than the dementia. I think it's a side effect of the medication. But the medication's working so well, you're terrified of changing it or going on to something else and maybe knocking yourself back that way. Thankfully, they're not nearly as frequently as they would have been when I went on, but they're just so vivid and so real that it's like I wake up squealing, because you think you're either being chased or mugged or held down, and it's all so real, But as I say, thankfully, sort of once that sort of happens, I wake up and my husband sort of reassures me everything's sort of okay, and I may or may not get back to sleep. But I say, so for me, I think it's more with the medication than actually with the dementia. But I would wake up a lot earlier than I ever would have done, and I don't know if that's because of the dementia or not. But as I say, I would be waking and sort of, have 4 or 5 o'clock most mornings. And that's without haven't necessarily had the nightmare.
I can agree with the Allison saying about the nightmares and how real and vivid they are, and how you wake up still in that aura or mode of the feelings and everything, and it takes quite a while, especially when you've had one just before it's time to wake up. You're still in it. Sometimes it's like, just leave me alone. I'm not with it yet. The other thing that happens to me is as soon as I close my eyes, I have terrible thoughts. They're not flashbacks, but they're constant thoughts of hurts, things that happened to me in my marriage and things that happened with my children. And it's constant right through the night. And I've tried different things to put music on and do things, but it's just a constant. The other thing that I thought of is I go to bed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I have a deep, deep sleep from 3 o'clock till 5 o'clock. And you can set at 5 o'clock, I'll be awake. If I'm not, my dog wakes me up. So that time I have a very deep sleep, peaceful sleep. So I don't know if it kind of makes up for during the night.
I'm talking about my mother, and I'm talking about my mother before we knew she obviously did have dementia, but she was in denial and we didn't know anything about it. And she was living on her own. And she obviously had a lot of problems with sleep. One of the ones is the one that Allison mentioned, and she wasn't on any medication, but what she had, I was staying there actually. I eventually woke up, but I was woken by noises, banging noises and shouting noises. And she was in the bathroom and she'd hurt herself because she'd been bashing at the cupboards. And she was saying that there'd been somebody in there who was attacking her. So she'd woken up, and whether she was going for a wee or not, or whether it was a nightmare or not, I don't know. But she was convinced that she was like repelling I suppose it probably was a burglar. I don't know what it was, but she certainly wasn't on medication. That was so. That seems to be a common thread. And another one, which was about the day and night, and so she was living on her own. And she used to have the television on most of the time, but she also had all the curtains drawn. She wasn't facing up to anything. She covered everything up. And she phoned my brother up several times, but in the night. And particularly once, she phoned him up about 3 o'clock in the morning. And he said, "Oh, Mum, you know, it's nighttime. And she said, no, it's not, because people are playing cricket. So she was obviously watching the television, and it must have been Australian cricket, I suppose, or something like that. And so she had a rationale for both these incidents. She had a reason for that.
I think seasons make a difference as well, because one lady that I was supporting, her husband had dementia. And when it started to get dark, you know, winter time, 4:30, off he'd trot and he put his pajamas on, because of course it was dark and it was bedtime. So I think that's one of, you know, a great problem, that logically dark means you go to bed. I never heard of that he was up for hours and hours in the summer. But on the other hand, it was the winter time that really made the biggest difference. And it's very difficult to try and explain to somebody that it is only 4:30 in the afternoon. If you live on your own, it's even more difficult, because you would probably in the winter time think it's dark and actually go to bed at 4:30. And probably people are up, you know, during the night wondering why they're not sleeping, because their clock has completely changed because of the season, really.
There are people who get up in their pajamas and go out. And quite often they're not wandering. Wayfaring is the nice way to say it. Their purpose, they know what they're going to do. So that obviously it is something to do with their clock, that I'm awake, up, often forgetting to dress in outdoor clothes, and that's why it gets so worrying, doesn't it?